Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mr. Rowe. We're looking on Problem Stat. This is Part A, Lesson 6, and we're going to talk about the empirical rule and how to apply the normal distribution to help you solve a few problems. So let's take a look at what the normal distribution is. So right here we have our normal distribution. If you recall from looking at the lesson, the normal distribution, the mean is right here in the middle, so that is where the mean is. And then what does that mean? That means that there are 50% of the data values above the mean because it's a normal distribution and 50% below. All right, so what do these other marks mean? Well, once you talk about the mean, then we can use the standard deviation to help us find other values. So right here is the mean. If we add one standard deviation, and we subtract one standard deviation from the mean right here. So we end up with these two values right here. This is where 68% of the data will lie. So 68% of the numbers will be between one standard deviation of the mean. So then we can go one more standard deviation. So we got one more standard deviation right here. In between those two values is 95% of the data. So 95% of the numbers are between those two values. And we're going to go one more. And we'll go from 3 standard deviations to 3 standard deviations. 99.7% of the data will be between 3 standard deviations of the mean. So that's what we're going to use to solve some problems, to figure out some percentages where numbers lie using the normal distribution. So let's take a look at some more details here. So here's our normal distribution again. We've already talked about the 50% and 68%. So let's look at that one standard deviation again. So we said that was 68%, right? So 68% lie between those two values right there. Well, that also means that right here is 34%. And right here is also 34%. So 34% of the data is one standard deviation below, and 34% is one standard deviation above. But we also can talk about this section out here. Well, if 68% is between those two values, if we take 100 and we subtract 68, that gives us 32%. So guess what? Right here, 16% will be one standard deviation above, and 16% will be one standard deviation below. 16 and 16 is 32. Okay, so let's take a look at the 95% margin here. So let's erase all of this. Let's talk about the 95% margin. So it's 2 standard deviations. Here's the mean, here's 2 standard deviations. 95% of the data is here. So you divide that by half to get this percentage. So that would be 47.5%. 47.5%. And then you also have this percentage out here. Well, if there's 95% between those two values, that means there's 5% outside of those two values from each side. We'll have 2.5%. So that's kind of the information you're going to need to help you figure out some problem solving in this lesson. So make sure that you're familiar with these percentages. Go through and look at them several times and make sure you understand them. So here is an example like in the lesson. This is a test with a normal distribution has a mean of 60. So that means that right here, that's going to be 60. And that's what you want to do. You want to take the normal distribution. You want to write that value as the mean right there in the middle. And it says it has a standard deviation of 6. So draw the distribution. Well, that means we're going to have to add all the proper numbers. So one standard deviation above, one standard deviation below. We're going to take 60, we're going to subtract 6, we're going to take 60, we're going to add 6. So 60 minus 6, that'll give us 54. That's our lower number right here. 60 plus 6 is 66, and we'll just keep doing that until we fill in our blanks. So plus 6 is 72, plus 6 is 78. Go to the other side, 54 minus 6 is 48, and then 48 minus 6 is 42. And that's really all we need for this. So let's take a look at these answers. And again, this question here, I kind of wrote it wrong, so let me kind of make a correction here. So it should read 90% of test takers score at least, is what it should say. What value? Well, remember that 97.5, well, that's 2.5%. That's kind of the key thing, because plus 2.5 will give us 100. So remember that was 3 standard deviations. Remember it was, right here was 34 and 47, and then 2.5 was out here. So that means that right here and above, if we go back and look at our numbers here, so here was the 2.5% right there. So everything above there would be 97.5%. So we'll score at least a 48 on this test. So everybody's going to score at least a 48. All right, so B says 16%. Well, you remember when we did our distribution here, that was the 1 standard deviation. So 1 standard deviation right here, that was 68%. And then above that was 16. And below that was 16. So that means that whatever that value is, 16% score at least that much, or higher. 16% score higher than that. So what is that value? Well, right there, it's 66. So 16% score over 66. And then this last one says 68% score between what values? Well, that was that 1 standard deviation right here. So 68% right here score between 54 and 66. I hope this helps you understand the empirical rule and the normal distribution a little bit better. There's percentages that you have to understand. If you still struggle with these as you're doing your assignment, please let me know in a teacher message or make an appointment for help.